The Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky was created to prove that the Genesis account of creation is scientifically accurate. The museum depicts two prehistoric children playing by a waterfall after Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Dinosaurs play nearby. What you're supposed to believe when you see it is that dinosaurs, and the world for that matter, are only 6,000 years old, which matches with the creation story if you say that every day of creation is 1,000 years. The organization that created the museum spent $27 million on the museum because they don't think people take seriously enough that the Bible is without error. They're called biblical inerrantists, and they're worried that secular scientific claims undermine the Bible, and that could lead to people thinking that God doesn't exist. In the book we're using by her this fall, the Reverend Jennifer Butler says in her second chapter that this kind of reading of Genesis misses the boat altogether in terms of what Genesis is really about. The creation story was never meant to be a scientific account of how we or the world came into being. The creation story was meant to be a story that conveyed what kind of God created us. In the ancient Near East, there were many creation stories that were floating around, and most of them centered on capricious, powerful gods that could care less about human or animal or planet life because such life was cheap and was only considered in terms of how it could serve the selfish desires of the god. The creation story in Genesis was radical and alternative. Rather than creating from the blood and bones of his enemy Tiamat, as was the case with the god Marduk, the God of the Hebrews created humankind in God's image and then called all of creation good. The humans weren't created to be slaves to a God, but to care for each other and all of creation. Butler's point is that how we image God or tell the story of God deeply impacts the kind of world we're trying to build. Rather than building a world where violence and power and conquest and domination form a political platform for a ruler backed by capricious gods, we are building a world where care and community and dignity and respect are the foundation. Based on the image of the God who is described in Genesis, we're building a world that is democratic, that is by the people, for the people, rather than autocratic, absolute power held by one. While we might be building a world that is democratic, it's important to distinguish between what parts of our government are faith-related and what parts are not. In 2004, while some of you were young and others of you weren't yet born, 40 Christian leaders and 40,000 citizens signed a petition titled, "God is not a Democrat or a Republican." I'm pretty sure I was one of the 40,000. It was published in the New York Times on August 30th of that year, prior to the presidential election. The petition was created in response to comments by the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who reportedly said, "It is the responsibility of every political conservative, every evangelical Christian, every pro-life Catholic, every traditional Jew to get serious about re-electing President Bush." There were other religious leaders weighing in too about the necessity of re-electing President George W. Bush. The petition in the New York Times said this: "These leaders of the religious right mistakenly claim that God has taken a side in this election and that Christians should only vote for George W. Bush. We believe that claims of divine appointment for the president, uncritical affirmation of his policies, and assertions that all Christians must vote for his re-election constitute bad theology and dangerous religion. We believe that sincere Christians and other people of faith can choose to vote for President Bush or Senator Kerry for reasons deeply rooted in their faith. We believe that all candidates should be examined by measuring their policies against the complete range of Christian ethics and values. We will measure the candidates by whether they enhance human life, human dignity, and human rights, whether they strengthen family life and protect children, whether they promote racial reconciliation and support gender equality, whether they serve peace and social justice, and whether they advance the common good rather than only individual, national, and special interests. The petition goes on to say, we also admonish both parties and candidates to avoid the exploitation of religion or our congregations for partisan political purposes. By signing this statement, we call Christians and other people of faith to a more thoughtful involvement in this election rather than claiming God's endorsement of any candidate. This is the meaning of responsible Christian citizenship. People of faith, proceeding in good faith and for essentially religious reasons, can come to different conclusions about whom to vote and what policies to support. As the great evangelical theologian Carl F.H. Henry once said, there is no one direct line from the Bible to the ballot box. Faithful discipleship and responsible citizenship require us to say no to those who would assert a divine imperative for any party or candidate and who claim to know with cocksure certainty the mind of God. Let our religious convictions influence how we vote, but in the final analysis, our vote should be based on which candidate would best serve the commonweal and most effectively improve the lives of all Americans. And that was the end of the petition. What was at stake then and is still at stake today is that we get confused about God and politics. While it is true that God can work through leaders of all kinds, including those in office, it is not true that just because someone in office claims to be religious, that God is directing or leading or guiding that person. George W. Bush is an example of a president who crossed the line in terms of how his religion influenced his politics. He became a born-again Christian when he was 40 years old and struggling with addiction. As with many later in life converts, he was deeply committed to his faith, and he believed that God had placed him in the presidency for a particular reason. The problem was that his reason was flawed and had a huge impact on his foreign policy. He was what is known as a Protestant millennialist, which is not the same as a millennial, which is a term that we are all used to, very different things. In an article called The Influence of Religion on Foreign Policy by John Judas, millennialism is described this way. Many of the Pentecostals and fundamentalists who make up the religious right embrace a dissenting form of Protestant millennialism that English theologian John Nelson Darby brought to the United States in 1859. This view of history is deeply pessimistic and has often reinforced an insular view of the U.S. role in the world. Darby contended that the period from Christ's crucifixion to the end times before the millennium was a parenthesis. The end times would begin with the abrupt return of Jesus to rapture the true believers to heaven. These exemplary Christians would be spared 7 years of bloody tribulation, which would take place in Israel, to which the Jews would have returned and taken place and laid claim. At the end of 7 years, Jesus would return to defeat Satan in the battle of Armageddon, and the millennium would begin. Christians who adhered to this theory believed that their main task on earth was to lead model lives so that they could be raptured before the tribulation. For most of the last century, many of them eschewed politics and had no view of foreign policy except for a strong interest in the Jewish return to Israel. Even now, when many have entered politics primarily to combat what they see as a secular threat to their faith, they remain wedded to a very narrow view of U.S. foreign policy objectives focused on Israel. Much of the religious right backed the war in Iraq, not because they wanted to democratize the Middle East, but precisely because Iraq's Saddam Hussein had threatened Israel, which they are determined to protect in preparation for the end times. Maybe it's difficult for us to understand how incredibly dangerous this kind of theology is, but it is even more dangerous in the hands of a president of a democratic nation. Part of the reason George W. Bush was reelected in 2004 is that many people living in the United States did not understand how this very narrow belief of his was dictating so much of U.S. foreign policy at the time. Why am I preaching about politics? We are doing a series on reclaiming the Bible so we can resist tyranny. And it's critical that we understand what the Bible says and how we are to read and understand and apply the Bible. If we read the Bible as narrowly as the biblical inerrantists, we cling to creationism against all else, which means trying to continually disprove science. We all know from experience what a disaster that is. If we read the Bible and imagine that the book of Revelation is not only the last book of the Bible, but the most important one, and if we try to extract fact from it, we end up like former President Bush, whose foreign policy largely rested on protecting Israel. The book of Revelation has perplexed scholars, and there is great disagreement about how it is to be read. To take any one book and say this one is more important than all the others, or this one explains God, is a mistake. Spending $27 million to prove that God created the world in 6 actual days is a mistake. In the same way, giving God a label like Democrat or Republican, which are labels these days that most of us don't even like, is a mistake. It's not about the label. It's not about the party. It's not about winning and losing. It's not about one part of the Bible. So what is it about? If we take the Bible as a whole, the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures, we can paint a broad brushstroke and say that the Bible is about a God who is unlike any other God, and about a people who struggled to be in relationship with that God instead of the competing and capricious gods who cared nothing about their well-being. The Bible is about a world that could be different if we could imagine that every human and creature and plant and tree and water source is divine, or if we even want to expand it to say it's sacred. If humans and animals and plants and water were sacred, how would we then treat each other? We would have a Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We would add in a constitution that every person has equal protection under the law. We would spend our living and dying days trying to make this a reality. But we would go further, because Jesus came into the world as a poor Jewish man living under the regime of the Roman Empire, forced to be an immigrant, another brown man with his back up against the wall, in the words of Howard Thurman. Jesus, though, showed the power of community to restore people to wholeness and health. Jesus resisted the tyranny of the Roman Empire by feeding people, by healing people, by restoring people to community while others wanted to condemn them, by showing that as soon as we want to exclude or harm or reject a whole group of people, we lose our own humanity. What gets confusing for people of faith is to actually separate the democratic ideals upon which our country was founded, though has never been lived up to, and the Christian faith we were taught or learned over time. Which came first? Which is more important? Though I was not raised in the church until I was 9 years old, I don't remember a time when I lived in this country that wasn't influenced by my faith. It would be impossible for me to separate the two. However, that doesn't mean I can't be critical of both, in the sense of examining and critiquing both in order to improve. When Hannah Nicole Jones of the New York Times came out with her 1616 project and said that it's because Black Americans have fought to make our false democratic ideals true that we even have a democracy left at all, she was right. And the struggle of Black Americans to help our country live up to its ideals is not just a Christian struggle. When the drafters of the Constitution said, all men are created equal, did they use Genesis 1:27 or have it in mind? Does it matter? Very few of us have the stomach for politics, especially in light of the MAGA Republicans who would like to place a tyrant back in office to the destruction of people and planet. But in a time like this, we cannot afford to opt out. Our city is in crisis, and there are groups of people all over the city who want to exclude some in favor of others. I attended the committee meeting on Friday for immigrant and refugee rights through the city council, and it was the worst meeting I have attended in Chicago so far, and that's saying something. I signed up for public comment so that I could share some things about our Faith Community Initiative, and at the end of my time, I said this: we must remember that one of the sharpest tools in the toolbox of white supremacy is the pitting of one oppressed group against another oppressed group, so that the groups fight each other instead of fighting against the oppressor. What played out during the hearing was exactly that. Every single time in the history of our fledgling democracy that one group of people wants to exclude or hate or belittle another group of people, it has not gone well. We must be a voice for the vision Jesus lived, restoring all people to humanity and community. We must not let anyone convince us that a whole group of people is undeserving of human dignity and respect and the basic needs of food, shelter, and clothing. God is not a Democrat or Republican and never will be, but we are people who live in a country whose democracy is fragile and whose democracy is the only hope that many countries around the world cling to. If our democracy fails, so will the many democracies that are much younger and weaker than ours. We have a role to play at a time like this. Though we despair, we must not give up. Though we fear, we must not give in. Though we are disgusted, we must not walk away. We will continue to model what faith looks like in action. We will continue to work for a democracy that works for everyone. And in the process, we will continue to celebrate every small victory in building a world where the beloved community is a reality. Amen.